very short section of the introduction, which we did not cover at the beginning. The section is called The Single Intention as a Tradition Building Text. 2 nights ago, I shared it with the Kagyu Sangha group, and I thought maybe we should quickly go over this. I think it's helpful to contextualize the Gongchik. Basically, what Sobish is saying in this section is he says that one way you can think of it as the coming together of Gongchik represents the coming together of a tradition. I think many of us think, when we say Kagyu or Drikung Kagyu, we think, that it was like this all along. It has always been like this all along. But of course it is not like this. And even at the beginning, in the 12th century, during Jigten Sumgön's time, there's probably no sense of very clearly yet, like, oh, we are Kagyupas. And in fact, the name Kagyupa or Kagyu was used by many other groups as well. Ka is the Buddha's words or the Buddha's instructions, the Buddha's authoritative words. Ka. So again, honorific term. Buddhas have Ka. We ordinary beings, we cannot say we are Ka. So Buddhas have Ka. So Buddhas. So this. So Kagyu means the lineage of Ka, lineage of the Buddha's authoritative instructions. So in fact, in this period, you'll see writings saying things like Atisha Kagyu. So the lineage of Atisha's authoritative words. So, and various other Kagyu. It was just a general term. Only later, that this term became almost exclusively associated with that family. I would call it a family of practitioners related to each other with a common set of teachers. Became what we now call Kagyu. So coalescing around figures like Gampopa, Pamodrupa, Dusun Khenpa, first Karmapa, and then going back to Milarepa, to Marpa, sort of reading backwards. As sometimes I've said, in a way, lineage is something that you build backwards. We think of lineage as, from before to here, right? Yeah, of course, in that sense. But I think that is more like conceptually, as a concept. You say a lineage comes from the distant past to the present. But in a way, if you think about it more, lineage is something constructed from now backwards. As in, let's say you're listening to me now, right? And I said, oh, my teacher is so-and-so, or my teachers are so-and-so. Then you look at who they are, right? And who are their teachers? And then you look at who they are and who are their teachers, right? So now a line is being constructed all the way back to the source, so to say. Right? So in that way, it goes backwards. Lineage. So anyway, Sobish is saying, in the 12th century, at the time of the gathering together of these Vajra statements, we can see this moment as a moment where a sense of identity and cohesiveness is coming together as Kagyu, and even more specifically as Drikung Kagyu. He says, at the same time, you can also see this happening over in a different geographic area of Tibet, towards the south. Drikung is more like in the center, central Tibet, north of Lhasa. Then towards the south in this area called Sakya, meaning gray earth, which is different from the Sanskrit Shakya Muni. This is Sakya. Kya is gray. Sa is earth or ground. Satya. So Satya, there, is another tradition in formation, beginning to have an identity. And there, it is coalescing around a particular family called the Kun family. The heart of the Sakya tradition is the Kun family transmission. To this day, the heads of the Sakya lineage are from the Kun lineage. Just like the Drigong Kagyu, until 17th century, the main holders of the tradition are from the Kyura family, which is Jiden Sumgön's family, the Kyura family. And the Satya are the Kun family. So at the same time, the Sakyapas were also coming together. And Sobish compared one of their key texts, which is called Clear Differentiation. So here on page 24. Seen from this perspective, the attempt to define a single essential intention provides a unique identifier for the Kagyupas, and thus, too, a delineation from other groups, perhaps more importantly, from the scholarly and tantric traditions of the Sakyapas. Sobish said that in some ways you could see the rise of this text called Gongchik and the rise of Sakyapa self-identification arose in a way you could say interdependently. They arose interdependently. This term is really important term for Jigden Sungön, for Kyoba Rinpoche. Dependent origination. Such self-identification and delineation were mutual. While Sherab Jungne began to teach the single intention in 1226, the Gongchik in 1226, Sakya Pandita composed his clear differentiation around 1232. If it is not so that one of these titles is making a conscious reference to the other, their obvious mutual reference must be one of the great coincidences in history. In other words, Sobish is saying, it's not coincidence. First, Sherab Jungne started to teach what he called Gongchik. He gave that name, right, Gongchik, to that collection of Vajra statements. And then before long, Sakya Pandita decides to write this extended essay called Clear Differentiation. Also has been translated into English. Clear Differentiation is a extended essay, whereas you could say Gongchik is a collection of single liners, single lines, one line, one line, one line. So these collection of one-liners by Kyoba Rinpoche. The Gongchik is the program of a tradition that chiefly seeks to attain the realization of the mind by making the disciples' devotion meet the Guru's blessing. And then in parenthesis, with devotion and blessing having special connotations, as will be seen in the text. So whatever we think devotion and blessing is, it's not so straightforward. You have to try to understand how this tradition uses these terms. Almost everything in the Gongchik points to that single essential realization, and that realization also pervades everything within it. The clear differentiation by Sakya Pandita, on the other hand, is the program of a tradition that seeks to thoroughly differentiate all elements of the Buddhist teachings through clearly defined and distinct categories. Thereby, the Sakyapas can describe, for instance, the vehicles of the Shravakas, Bodhisattvas, and Tantric adepts as fundamentally different endeavors with different goals. Hence, the full title of Sakya Pandita's text is A Clear Differentiation of the Three Vows. Can you all see the difference that Sobish is making for us? Highlighting for us? Do you all see that? Hello? Wake up. Say something.
Yes, yes, we can see it.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. In some ways, Sakya Pandita's clear differentiation of this style is what we sort of have inherited, in the West. Because some of the earlier texts and traditions translated into English from Tibetan Buddhism are Gelugpa materials, and to some degree Sakyapa materials, and they tend to be this style. And furthermore, even in the works of Chogyam Trungpa, Trungpa Rinpoche, in some ways, although Kagyu Nyingma, but when he presents these, at least at that formative stage of his teachings in the West, unfortunately, he died, very early. But at that point, he has set up these seminaries, he calls them, annual gathering where he would teach, systematically. So he would teach first Hinayana. So there are these transcripts called the Hinayana seminars, and then the Mahayana seminars, and then the Vajrayana seminars. Now they have published a lot of these transcripts into 3 volumes, I think. The Hinayana, and I have the 3rd one. It's called the Tantric Path on, let me see if I can read, Indestructible Wakefulness. So they've published all this, and the thrust of these books, even among like Kagyu Nyingma teachers teaching in the West, tends to emphasize differences. If they are not emphasizing it, they are still working on an underlying kind of underlying tone, whereby difference is emphasized. Difference is assumed. So in a way, Gyalpa Rinpoche's approach is a little different. I see this more and more. Even in terms of my own learning and growth, I can see how earlier is much more influenced by this, like, first Hinayana, then Mahayana, then Vajrayana. And you'll see, like in this Gongchik text, that organization schema is used. So it's called like the individual liberation vows. So discussion following that chapter 3. Chapter 4, the Bodhisattva training. Chapter 5, secret mantra samayas. Yes, the schema is used. It's not like Drigung Kagyu doesn't use. It's not like Gyalpa Rinpoche doesn't use these categories. But while using these categories, he always wants us to look at all of this as comprehensive. So you don't see so much him emphasizing, this practice here, that is Hinayana. That practice there, that is Mahayana. That practice there is Vajrayana. Yes, you can tease out these differences. Yes, you can tell. You can say, over here, there is no explicit Vajrayana language here. Such as the other day, we were doing some other practice, and somebody said, here the offerings only mention what I can see and tell as what we would call outer offerings. What about the inner and the secret? Then I pointed out, well, that text is from the sutras, and therefore, not surprisingly, we're not going to find vocabulary like inner and secret so explicitly mentioned. That's understandable because the text is a sutra text and not a tantra. So it's not like Jiten Simgon is not aware of all these differences. And it's not like he did not skillfully use these differences when necessary. But overall, the style and the emphasis is on the oneness, is on the cohesiveness, is on the harmonious working of all these different elements. One analogy I like to use is, rather than even thinking of Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana as stages per se, although in some contexts you will see how they are stages, but I think more useful to think of it, to see it as the different ingredients that you need for, say, making a cake. So when you have a recipe, for making a cake, right? You're not going to say, oh, the flour is more important than the eggs. Or, wow, the vanilla, it's like the essence of the flavor. That is the supreme ingredient in this recipe. You're not going to get a cake, if you're only going to use your supreme vanilla. And then even something as mundane as, a cup of water, you cannot say, oh, that's just so basic, Sometimes we don't even need that. Try baking your cake and see what happens. Half a teaspoon of baking powder, is important. A pinch of salt is important. Every element is important. Yes, as I learned the hard way, especially certain types of cakes or certain types of baking, you cannot put all the ingredients in whatever order you feel like putting them in. There is an order, but the order doesn't imply, oh, what you start with is less important, and what you put last is the most important. Or, what you start with is more important. What you put in last is less important. No, the order has nothing to do with what's more important. The order is simply how, due to the wisdom of bakers, Buddhas, they have discovered that this is the best order in order to produce cake or to produce Buddhas. So all the elements are equally important, equally supreme, equally the best in order to produce the state of Buddha. Continuing on, the distinct approaches of these two traditions are also visible in the literature they employ. While they both rely on sutras, tantras, dohas are the songs of the Mahasiddhas, all genres of instructions and so forth, their selection of Indian scholarly treatises and tantric commentaries is entirely dissimilar. Other than the Sakyapas, who study a vast array of Indian scholarly treatises, the Drigungpas only seem other than the Sakyapas. Maybe it should be unlike the Sakyapas, who study a vast array of Indian scholarly treatises, the Drigungpas only seem to rely on the few authors of such works whom they also perceive as accomplished tantric masters and mahasiddhas. So Nagarjuna, Asanga, Shantideva, and the works that the Drigung commentaries, early commentaries, will quote from Madhyamaka Avatara, Uttara Tantra Shastra, Mahayana Sutra Lankara, and Bodhicaya Avatara. Top of 25. Mere scholarly discourse for the sake of debate and philosophical speculation does not play a role in the Drigung study program. Moreover, Indian tantric commentaries which play a major role in Sakya literature, are absent in Drikung studies. Tantric practice is received only through the respective rituals and the genres of direct instructions. Instead, the Drikungpas use, following a style used by Pamodrupa, they use stories, so these Jataka tales, and tantric stories from tantric oral traditions. They use these stories to illustrate the aspect of dependent origination of a teaching through the stories of events in the former lives of the Buddha or his disciples, and of the experiences of Indian and sometimes Tibetan siddhas. So some core Indian Buddhist texts, and then lots of usage of stories of the past lives of Buddhas, of Mahasiddhas, as examples to illustrate the deeper meanings, the interdependent, the dependent origination of various aspects of our practice. So I suggested the other day, I said, so with regard to these stories, there's a great resource right now on 84,000.co called The 100 Deeds. This is a collection of 100 stories of the past lives of the Buddha and the Buddha's chief disciples. So maybe during this, what I've been calling the zombie apocalypse, maybe what you can do is download this text, The 100 Deeds. And Nathan has provided the link in the chat window. And then every day read one story. And then you can see whether, into story number what, story number 15 or 74 or 42, the apocalypse is going to end. You read one story a day. Then if you finish 100 stories and still apocalypse has not ended yet, then I don't know what to do. Hopefully, the zombie apocalypse is going to end before the 100 stories, the 100 deeds end. That would be a good thing to do. Okay, comments or questions?
There's this apparent delineation between Qigong and Sakyapa.
Mm-hmm.
Is that same delineation between kind of this blending together, this emphasis on the whole cake in the Qigong? Is there the same delineation between Qigong and other lineages, like Nyingma lineages?
Hard to extend like that. I think Sobish is using the most obvious, and also because of the very close number of years between the composition of these two texts. And so he's using these as two very specific examples where he knows. In fact, what he doesn't tell us there is that, and I elaborated on this at the Kagyu Sangha, Sherab Jungne and Sakya Pandita, they had a good relationship. They knew each other. They spent time together exchanging teachings with each other. When Sakya Pandita's uncle, Sachen Kunga Ningpo, an important Sakyapa, the Sakyapa tradition, they have what they call the 5 fathers of the lineage, and Sakya Pandita is one of them. So I think when his uncle, I don't remember very well, but I think it was his uncle Sachen Kunga Ningpo, I think, when he passed away, Sakya Pandita actually requested Sherab Jungne to be the chief officiant for the funeral, to be the main person doing the fire puja. And Lama Ngedun might be interested to know that in fact Sakya Pandita requested Sherab Jungne, I think, to perform the Kunrik rituals for the uncle. And so this is sort of a great honor for Sherab Jungne. So Sherab Jungne and Sakya Pandita had a close relationship, and they spent time together, they exchanged teachings. But nonetheless, Sakya Pandita's clear differentiation, as I said, it's been translated, is called elucidation or clear differentiation of the three vows. Nonetheless, Sakya Pandita in that text, intellectually attacked, not like physically, but attacked, some of the positions that are in the Gongchik that he found objectionable. Of course, he has his reasons for objecting. And if you want to be truly non-sectarian, you also need to read Sakya Pandita's objections. But, that is if you want to be a scholar, If you want to achieve enlightenment, then no need, So it's hard to generalize and say, and therefore, Drigong. So all I can suggest is like, when you listen now, to other teachers teaching from other traditions, or even within the tradition, you listen carefully and see what they're saying, and see how they match up with what we're going to learn from the Gongchik. Kenjen Rinpoche, I don't think this is controversial, but also, no need to go repeat a lot, just to make a point, Kenjen Rinpoche, he said to me, even when his feeling, like even when there is some very learned Khenpo now in Drigong, very learned in all the different traditions and texts, even when they kind of teach the Gongchik, he feels that they are still not getting, like Gyalpa Rinpoche's emphasis. And they're still treating it more, which is caution for us, that he feels that they are still treating it as if it is a subject of debate and disputation. Because there's so much the style of the scholarly tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, which is to debate, to argue, not even out of sectarian, like even laying aside, right, the problem of sectarianism. Nonetheless, debating and arguing is so valued within the kind of Khenpo education, Geshe education, so that when these experts, get together and study these texts, they still kind of quickly fall into this other way of operating, which in some ways you could say it's subjecting something like the Gongchik to the standards established by the scholastic tradition. Mm-hmm. I personally feel, even though I have to confess, I have no access to reading the two early commentaries, like Dorje Sherab and Rinjangma, because they have not been translated into English. But in this book, Sobish provides excerpts from Dorshema and Rinjangma. And between the Dorshema and the Rinjangma, which he points out, Dorshema is much more scholarly in its tone, in its commentary. Rinjangma is much more meditative, much more kind of practitioner-oriented, yogi-oriented, meditation-oriented. So already I see, even in this early period, between these two positions, Dorshema is already anticipating criticisms and attacks by the scholarly tradition. Yeah, so he's already starting to kind of build the Drigong defense against these attacks. Whereas Rinjangma seems to be unconcerned about these potential criticisms and attacks. Rinjangma seems wholly focused on what does this mean for a practitioner? What does this mean for a meditator? And is unconcerned to defend the Vajra statement. Nimanangwa, Light of the Sun by Choki Drakpa, composed several centuries later. No choice. In his commentary, he has to defend. Because by his point, like it or not, Gongchik has been pulled into scholarly debates. In fact, much of the scholarly debate until the composition of Nima Nangwa was done by other people, not even Drigong people, defending Gongchik. It was Kamakagyu. Some of the Shamapas were great scholars. They wrote commentaries to defend the Gongchik against the scholarly debates. Eighth Karmapa also did things with Gongchik. Although Sobish points out, eighth Karmapa often would change the Vajra statements in order to make it maybe more palatable to the scholarly tradition. And so from the perspective of the Drigong, we would say that the eighth Karmapa had other interests. He's not really being faithful to what Jigten Singban is trying to do with this material. And so in a way, you could say that maybe the eighth Karmapa, which was a great scholar, actually, a very brilliant scholar, learned, that the eighth Karmapa was trying, to defend the Kagyu. Because Gongchik, in a way, is not just Drigong Kagyu. It's a Kagyu, a general sort of, you could say, Kagyu position. So much so, for example, recently, the Library of Tibetan Classics, a project supported by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and his Dalai Lama's official interpreter, Thupten Jinpa, Dr. Geshe Dr. Thupten Jinpa. He is the chief editor for this whole series. This whole series, like maybe 25 volumes or something like that, which is every major tradition gets a volume. And then different genres. So Lojong is not really a tradition, but a genre, gets a volume. The medical tradition gets a volume. History tradition gets a volume. Folk wisdom gets a volume. Then, of course, Sakyapa gets a volume. Kagyupa gets a volume. Lamrim gets a volume. Kadampa gets a volume. Gelugpa gets a volume. Nyingma gets a volume. So the Kagyupa volume, called Mahamudra and Related Instructions. So in that collection was decided by Khenchen Trungpa Rinpoche, the great scholar and master of the Gama Kagyu tradition. Khenchen Trungpa Rinpoche chose Gongchik, the root verses, to be included in there. He said that the Gongchik represents, the first kind of distillation of the Kagyu viewpoint. He says that Gongchik, right, represents the earliest example of a clear distillation of the Kagyu view on many of these subjects. But in a way, you could also see how Jigten Sungwan will say, actually, no, it's not about the view. The view has also become a hot topic among scholars. What is the view? What is the view? And in the Gongchik, you'll see, Gyalpa Rinpoche actually also criticizing this business about view, calling our attention to the dangers of establishing views. When you have established views, then you get stuck in viewpoints. I am a reforming viewpoint alcoholic. The more I study, Gongchik and Jigten Sungwan, the more I'm seeing, yeah, it's something else, something else is going on. Other questions or comments? Or you could also type it in the chat if you don't want to speak. Then someone will read it for me. I can't really see from where I'm sitting. Oh, suddenly everybody's has unmuted.
I have a question regarding.
Can everybody mute and then the person speaking go ahead?
I have a question about potential.
Potential, okay.
Yeah, and the Mahayana Sutra Lamkara, potential for Buddhahood. I think that Sakya Pandita says that people have different potential and there is no way to change potential from some sentient.
Yes.
Yeah, that some sentient beings cannot achieve Buddhahood because they don't have the potential.
Yes.
Yeah, so what is, I think that Jigten Sungwan has different view.
Oh yeah, of course, Jigten Sungwan will say, no. You are getting stuck with words. Will be Jigten Sungwan's response to Sakya Pandita's extremely. I mean, Sakya Pandita is correct. He can quote, chapter and verse and counter quote and proof and bring a lot of quotes to show you how that is the case, according to these texts. But Jigten Sungwan rejects that. And again, we will see, more clearly Jigten Sungwan's position. And
okay.
And you're right, yeah. So that is a very good example, And sometimes now, I think in the West, especially, if you only read like general Dharma books, you will like, what? What do you mean Mahayana Sutra Lankara says that? What do you mean Sakya Pandita says that? How is that possible? Because, we have a very kind of all mushed up view about things, like, oh yeah, of course, all beings will become Buddha. Actually, if you look at these scholarly writings, of these past great masters, it's not so rosy.
Yeah.
Now, of course, the way Sakya Pandita is going to also, I don't know, I cannot say because I've not read that much of Sakya Pandita. I've read the Clear Differentiation and one or two of other things that he wrote that's been translated. But I think the way Sakya Pandita is going to simultaneously say, yes, there are some beings who don't have. Even Gampopa, right, in Jewel Ornament, talks about the 5 potentials. And the cut-off potential, right? But there Gampopa says, actually, they are all Buddha potential, right? And Gampopa in Jewel Ornament doesn't elaborate further, except to say that, yes, there are 5 potentials, but in fact, all these 5 potentials, they are just one potential, which is Buddha potential. So Sakya Pandita, in fact, will take exception to that and say, this is sloppy. You cannot say that. But then, how would Sakya Pandita, if a student said, so do I have the potential or not, right? Sakya Pandita, I think his response would be that you're even asking this question shows that you have the Buddha potential. So issue settled. Practice now, practice Mahayana, practice Vajrayana, you are going to become Buddha. So in a way, I think Sakya Pandita's way is to say, to sort of, you could say, have in theory, there are beings with no potential. But if you are even reading this text right now, it shows you already have the potential. No need to worry about it. So in a way, you could say Sakya Pandita will have his cake and eat it too. In English, that expression.
Okay.
I don't know why you would want to have your cake, keep it, and also eat it, Like cakes, right, after a few days, they're all dry, That expression is a very strange one. Have your cake and eat it too. It literally means you can eat it and then you can still keep your cake. But apparently, if you go to the internet, you can buy a slice of cake from the wedding of like Diana and Charles. So I guess you want to keep your cake.
Maybe.
Not eat it. You could sell on eBay, 50 years later.
Fine.
Let's look at page 31. This is under the subtitle of Single Wheels, Vehicle, Path, and Samadhi. The presentation of the unity of all teachings, wheels and paths, culminates in Vajra statement, chapter 1, statement 10.10, which has puzzled many generations of scholars in Tibet and the West. So this is a debate that has animated Tibetan scholars since the time of Gongchik. They debated, it's like, how can you say this, and then counter debate. Of course we can say this, So here, if, however, that statement is read, that statement which is 110, so let's quickly look at, I'll look at 110 and read to you what that statement is. 110, chapter 1, statement 10 says,
Page 89.
Chapter 1, no, 86. Vajra statement 110. It says, anything taught as the 6th position is only of definitive meaning. What are the 6 positions? In the art of interpreting the Buddha's words, the Indian scholars have come up with 6 possibilities, what they call the intentional, the non-intentional, the provisional, the definitive, the literal, and non-literal. These are scholarly devices that developed after the death of the Buddha in order to help people kind of deal with, right, all the different things that are said in the different sutras and tantras. So then these scholars said, well, you can try to see if this statement contradicts this other statement here, or even within one sutra, it seems like maybe over here it contradicts over here, then you need to see, well, is that an intentional statement or is that a non-intentional statement? Is that a literal statement or is that a non-literal statement? So this is their way of helping readers kind of navigate, right, this jungle of texts, so to say. So here clearly, is saying some are definitive and some are not definitive. But Jigten Sumgön's Vajra statement says all 6 positions are only of definitive meaning, which seems to cancel out the whole need for the 6 positions. Again, superficially. And superficially, it looks absurd. And in fact, going back to page 31, in the footnote, a modern scholar, Jonathan Gold, who translated Jigten Sumgön's, translated Sakya Pandita's works, he called Jigten Sumgön's position absurd. That Jigten Sumgön's position, that all the statements by the Buddha is definitive meaning, he says, this is absurd. Now, let's come back to here. If, however, that statement is read in the context of the position of others that were added to the Vajra statements by Sherab Jungme, it poses far fewer problems. Accordingly, Vajra statement 110 disputes the opinion that since the Buddha taught some teachings with a meaning requiring further explanation, and thus not with a definitive meaning, he thereby taught an untruth while employing that untruth as a skillful means. Such a view, according to which the teachings would have dissimilar purposes, is not acceptable to Jigten Sumgön. Instead, since the Buddha has taught the Dharma as the teaching of dependent origination of cause and result, to liberate the trainees and lead them to temporary happiness and to happiness and ultimately great bliss, the purpose of all teachings alike is to lead them to happiness and great bliss. Since in this way, there is nothing in the Buddha's teachings that does not have the same ultimate purpose. This is, as in the case of the instruction on the 3 wheels, the position of a single wheel, the Buddha vehicle, where no teaching falls outside the scope of the one vehicle and the one purpose. Ekayana, single Buddha vehicle, the Lotus Sutra teaches this. Together with the last 2 Vajra statements of the first chapter, this teaching builds the framework for the whole chapter. According to these 2 statements, there is ultimately only one family or one potential. Potential is a less literal translation of family. There is ultimately only one potential, the Buddha or Mahayana potential. This is because in the final analysis, quote, since there is no differentiation within the Dharma Dhatu, it is inappropriate to assume any differences in the potentials. The Vajra statement, 29 of chapter 1, is actually quoting from the Abhisamaya Lankara. Because the Dharma Dhatu cannot be differentiated, So how can these potentials said to be lasting differences? Like these potentials, they're talking about the Shravaka Buddha potential the Pratyeka Buddha potential, the Bodhisattva potential, or the Buddha, rather the Buddha potential, the full Buddha, Samyak Sambuddha potential, the indeterminate potential, and the cutoff potential, no potential, cut off from ever achieving freedom. It's very strange, for us, if we didn't know these differentiation. You say, what? Buddhists believe that? But yeah, it's in there, in the text, But these 5 potentials, So clearly here, right, you see an example of how clearly when Jiten Sumgön says all the Buddha statements are definitive, right? He's not saying, yes, definitively there are people who are cut off from freedom forever. He doesn't mean that when he says that all Buddha statements are definitive. What he means is, in those instances when the Buddha said, oh, the seeds are cut off, in this case, right? He is using this as a way to communicate to his specific audience an important point by saying, oh, here the seeds are cut off. And insofar as that point is important for the listeners to hear, then for those listeners, they are definitive. Definitive in the sense that if they take those words to heart, if they understood those words correctly, it will lead them closer to freedom from confusion, freedom from suffering. It will lead them closer to the state of Buddha. So it is not the case that they are cut off, that they have no potential. If the path and vehicle are only one, it suggests that the practice within them is also ultimately only one. And in fact, for instance, the 24th Vajra statement in the supplementary chapter, chapter 8, states that all samadhi is combined into one as the Vajra-like samadhi. So here the context is, you will see throughout the sutras and tantras mention of there's this samadhi, and then there's this samadhi, and then there's this samadhi, and then there's a samadhi called this and samadhi called that. And sometimes it's said, like Heart Sutra, for example, it said that when the Buddha was dwelling in the samadhi called the enumerations of phenomena, then Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, spoke the following words. So if you look at the sutras, there are all these different meditative states, which is what samadhi is, advanced meditative absorptions, and they have various different names. So the general opinion is there are all these different types of samadhis. But Jiten Sumgön said, actually all samadhi is basically just one samadhi, which is the Vajra-like samadhi. How so? Sobish explains. With this statement, the opinion is rejected that from the paths of accumulation and application, this is talking about the 5 paths, up to the 10th Bodhisattva stage, many different samadhis consecutively arise until the Vajra-like samadhi is finally achieved. That's the general view. From the beginning of the path, called the path of accumulation, and then the path of application, and then the path of joining. The path of accumulation, application, seeing, then meditation, then no more learning. These are the 5. The path of application is sometimes called the joining, the path of joining, alternative vocabulary. This is found in some texts, Mahayana text, that talks about the entire process of awakening as these 5 paths. Then another system talks about the same thing as the 10 bhumis or stages. So here again, Jiten Sunggun says, the 5 paths and the 10 bhumis are not 2 different things. They are talking about the same thing, but explained to different individuals. And so then there is also teachings or discussions about how, whether it's the 5 paths or the 10 bhumis, there are different samadhis that you will experience. And so then there's debate, among, again, the scholarly tradition. After all, Nalanda tradition is like that, and the Tibetans inherited that tradition, the Nalanda learning. There are lots of debates, which samadhi is which samadhi and which samadhi is which samadhi. Here, Jiten Sunggun says, no. Jiten Sunggun maintains that from calm abiding onward, right, the first practice, gateway to meditation, is establishing calm abiding. So he maintains that from calm abiding onward, when the union of the luminosity and emptiness is not disturbed by thoughts, the essence of the samadhi is already a form of the Vajra-like samadhi, and that its realization is gradually increased up to the 10th or the 13th Bodhisattva bhumis stage. He dismisses any idea that samadhis could have different purposes and functions. Instead, they all have but a single function and purpose. What does change is merely the practitioner's increasing ability to practice samadhi. So he says there's only one samadhi, which at the Buddha state is called the Vajra-like, the immovable samadhi. And then even when we first start training in shamatha, already we are training towards this final experience, the final fruition as Vajra-like samadhi. And then everything with all the different names, right? They are just the practitioner's increasing ability to practice samadhi. What I want to suggest that we do is you read the rest, the fundamental nature and the unity of view, practice, and conduct. Remembering like this is simply Sobish's introduction to the material, right? And I actually will not go into the rest of this introduction, but I want you to read carefully the rest of this introduction. I think now is time, I think some of you are already feeling this, like, come on, let's get to the Vajra statements. Let's get to the Vajra statements, So we will go to the Vajra statement. Then I want you to continue to read the root text. So the Light of the Sun root text, where Choki Drakpa begins with the preliminary by praise of the Buddhas, praise of Jigten Sumgun, praise of the author and early commentators. So I'm going to take pictures of these pages and send through WhatsApp. You can read all of that. Then he gives briefly summarizing by establishing the body of the treatise in general. So this is Choki Drakpa's introduction. So we have been looking at Sobish's introduction, and then there is Choki Drakpa's introduction to his commentary. That also, I'm not going to go through it at this point. Because in a way, right, the introductions are in fact more difficult to understand. You know, that's the irony. The introduction, in a way, introduces it, but at the same time, kind of tough to understand, hard to digest. So what we are going to do, I think, next time, on Monday when we meet again, we're going to start with Vajra statement number 1. Again, I will send those pictures for those of you who don't yet have the book. Vajra statement 1.1 is what we're going to look at. But do read all the other pages carefully, and do understand that the first time you read it, you're probably not going to get much out of it unless you have been studying Gongchik to some point, or unless you have been hearing this presented in other forms and formats, then it will be recognizable. But otherwise, don't worry too much about all the introductory material, because in some ways the introduction is harder, because they're making references to things that are dealt with in detail, you know, over here. So yeah, that's it for today. And again, in case there are any questions or comments or clarification that is needed.
Dr. Lai?
Yes.
Yes. Can you define what is definitive and interpretative?
Definitive is, that means what is said is no longer needing further interpretation. Interpretive is, you know, needing lots of interpretation.
Yeah, because whenever you explain about Jigten Sunggun's viewpoint, and then you say you mentioned it's definitive, but there's a lot of explanation and interpretation needed based on the context. So to me, it seems like it's interpretative instead of definitive.
No. Here, you have to understand first the context of what he is addressing. In the end, he doesn't have a problem with these categories that the scholastic tradition has come up with to help people understand better. Again, you see, this is the problem. In fact, I would say that if you remember that fundamentally these Vajra statements are uninterested in scholarly concerns, but its only interest is in the practitioner's, meditator's approach. Then you will understand that, in fact, what the scholarly tradition is doing is they're playing golf. What Jigten Sunggun is doing is he's playing tennis. They both involve balls being hit from one place to another place. Yeah, so they both look like, you know, they are similar in the sense that they are both games. And they're both involve people hitting balls. But to ask, you know, tennis players some questions that are important for golf players, or to ask golf players some questions that are important for tennis players, is to be asking kind of unnecessary questions. Our burden in studying Gongchik is because, you know, Gongchik has been dragged into the scholarly circles. So then Gongchik commentators have to kind of play that game. I think this is also Khenchen Rinpoche's point. Like, if we go back to Jigten Sunggun's purpose, then we can, in fact, not get into a lot of this unnecessary debate. Superficially, when you look at the Vajra statement, it seems like Jiten Sumgon is picking fights with the scholarly tradition, but he's not. Yeah? He's saying, because you have to remember again, he gave teachings to his disciples that came to him. And Sherab Jungne is picking up these one-liners from these teachings. Yeah. So of course, I can imagine a conversation when you sit down and you ask Jiten Sumgon, you say, wait, obviously that needs interpretation. He's like, yeah, of course that needs interpretation. But the context he's addressing is there are people who actually, in looking at these like useful devices that have been kind of promoted, right, to help you understand, they went too far. And there are implications to this. So they went too far, and actually we see it among modern practitioners. There are Vajrayana people who say, oh, that Theravada stuff, that's just Buddhism for dummies. That Hinayana stuff, like we are more advanced. It's to counteract those types of attitudes that Jiten Sumgon says, no, you have to understand that everything the Buddha said fundamentally is definitive. You first have to get that point. Then you can say, well, within that context, when he said, kill your father, because in the Tantra, there's a statement like that.
Yes.
He said, kill your father, Yeah, obviously you have to interpret that. You cannot say that is literal. Now go kill your father. But he says, before you get into the interpretive devices, that's what scholars will say. Before you get into using the interpretive devices, you should first get clear in your head the fundamental point of the instructions that he gave. And that's the meaning of, that is the definitive meaning.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah. So in a way, in the end, you could say there are no quarrels between Jiten Sumgon's position and the position of the Panditas, the scholars. I should use the word Pandita because scholars, we have a different connotation to scholars. Scholars, we think, especially like sometimes in the West, in the United States, there's an American tradition of poo-pooing scholarship. And say, oh, that's just, ugh. But Pandita, in the Buddhist tradition, they're not necessarily like, just bookworms. Pandita are well respected, So the way of the Pandita and the way of the yogi, so Milarepa on the one hand, and Sakya Pandita on the other hand, in a way you could say, they are doing different things. And in a way, there are no quarrels between the two. Unless when people get too arrogant, whether on the yogi side, on the Pandita side, then they will start having arguments. Whether the Pandita way or the yogi way, in the end, it's about changing minds. It's about purifying all the non-virtues, accumulating all the virtues. And that would be what Jigte Sumgon will say. It's about, purifying all the non-virtues. It's about bringing into fruition all the Buddha qualities. That is the whole purpose of everything that the Buddha taught. So it's a good question. I think it gives me this opportunity to remind all of us, this is not about how other people are wrong. This is about how, so when we look at those Vajra statements, in this text, you will see in bold is the statement, but right above the statement, not bolded, is the prevailing attitude or the prevailing misunderstanding that this Vajra statement should be understood. Kind of like what others say, meaning the context of this statement. That is provided by Sherab Jungne, it is said. Whereas Sherab Jungne says the Vajra statement is the words of the Guru, meaning his Guru, meaning Kyopa Rinpoche. Then what the context is provided by Sherab Jungne himself. So I want to show you. I don't know if you can see. Yeah, Vajra statement in bold. Sherab Jungne said that. The Lama said. Then above that, yeah, is the context that he provides. And he says, he's addressing this issue.
Okay.
Changchu sem chorim poche ma ge ba nam ge gyuji ge ba nyam ba me pa yang go ne gong du bell war shu. One last public service announcement. The Sung course, if you are interested, please go to tibetanspirit.com. If somebody can provide the link as well in this chat and also on WhatsApp, you can go and place your order. And what you'll be charged is the shipping to wherever this needs to be shipped. Starting from next week is when I'm going to ship this out. Some of you have also been able to find on that same page. You have to look kind of carefully. The app is not very good. The possibility of adding a donation. That's just, there. And no expectation really. But we always say, we provide others the opportunity to accumulate merit. When I told some Malaysian friends, when they asked, how much is the donation? I said, none. And the response I got from them is, oh, in Asia, if there is no donation, then there is no effect. Yeah, which is true, like that's the principle of merit. And they're like, well, if there's no donation, then there's no power. I said, well, in that case, why don't you donate to hungry people in Malaysia right now? There's a lot of people needing help. I said, no need to transfer money back and forth. Yeah, if you donate, you'll help me, but I'm not hungry, at least not yet, There are lots of hungry people in Malaysia. So again, wherever you are, please look around, your local area, there's a lot of help that is needed right now. But, if for whatever reasons you insist, and some of you did, and I appreciate that, thank you so much. I mean, it'll help in, paying for the material and all that. Some of you have also, I appreciate, for sure. But so there's a little kind of box that you will see, and sometimes you don't see. Also, some of you, when you didn't see the box and you still want to do it, my staff, Mariana, is telling me there are messages, in the checkout that says, please, I want to give blah, blah, blah. And then she will follow up with you on how to donate. But these Sungkors, they are the chakra, protection chakra of Panashawari. And this is really how the chakras should be prepared as these mandalas with the offering of thread, the 5 colored thread. So I am going to publicize this very soon on my Facebook, telling the rest of the world through Facebook, if you want one of these chakras, please go here and place your order, so that the reason for that order is so that I can buy the stamps through the platform that I'm using for Tibetan Spirit. Otherwise, I have it's way more complicated for me to go to the post office and to try to buy stamps and all of that. And right now, during this time, it's also not very advisable to do that. So I have to route it through the Tibetan Spirit website, and that's why. So if you want these, right now, I think it says there's maybe 80 left, something like that, somewhere thereabouts. So anyway, so again, these early next week, we will start sending them out as fast as we can. So please, and we ship everywhere. Of course, if it is international, it'll take a little longer for them to arrive. But even that, I think there is an option for you to choose quicker shipping for international. I think there is regular surface mail, what they call it. And then we also have, I think, USPS, Priority International, available, and also UPS, which is probably the quickest for international as well. So anyway, please take care of yourself. We will meet on Wednesday. Now we only meet 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And then if you were watching the Open Sangha program on Facebook, you will know that I'm also going to start a Lojong practice series. The Lojong practice series, frankly, will be much more applicable and practical for more general audience, people who are interested in the Dharma, in establishing a practice, and especially during these times. So if you have friends or people whom you think might be interested, you can first direct them to the video that is already now on the Urban Dharma Facebook page, which is last night's inaugural, you could say, teaching and practice of this Lojong series that I'm going to start. And tell them to kind of check back at the Facebook page for Urban Dharma for more details on the schedule. I still have yet to figure out this schedule. I want to also figure out a schedule that works for me. I have to admit that I used to be able to teach, continuously, but I'm feeling, the kind of effects of continuous teaching. As St. Paul would say, the body, the spirit is willing, but the body is weak. I could feel the body getting tense, actually, physically getting very tense, the body. And so this takes us back to the Vajra statement, while in samsara is the body that wanders and not the mind. And as long as we're beholden to the body, we have to pay attention and respect the body or surrender to the body from time to time. So all of you too, please take care of yourself. Don't overexert. Even when you're doing good things, it's possible to overexert. So pay attention to that. Listen to your body and strike some kind of balance. Sometimes you have to push yourself. You have to push the body. But sometimes you need to know skillful pushing and unskillful pushing. So anyway, good day, good night, take care.
Take care.
Thank
Take care,
you.
please.
Gracias.
Thank you.